One thing a man can never call me is a begging ash female. These were some of the last words Corinthian Shepard posted on Facebook. A strong woman declaring her independence. A mother of 4 finally choosing herself over a toxic marriage. But at 7:00 a.m. on July 5, 2025, a 911 call shattered the morning silence in Shreveport, Louisiana. Police found 40-year-old Corinthian dead in her own home. A single gunshot to the chest. Her husband, Richard Williams, stood outside. He tried to kill himself too. This woman's strength becomes her death sentence. She tried to walk away from a relationship that no longer served her. Why would saying, "I'm done," trigger a man's deadliest impulse? Today we're getting into a case that started with Facebook posts and ended with a funeral. A story that proves leaving isn't always the answer when you're dealing with a man who believes "till death do us part" is a threat, not a promise, but a threat. Welcome back to our channel, where we explore the darkest corners of human behavior and the stories that shake us to our core. Before we go deep into Corinthian's story, I need you to do something important. Drop your location in the comments below. Here's some more Facebook posts she made pointing towards her dissatisfaction with her husband's cheating lifestyle and the toxic marriage. Corinthian wasn't your typical domestic violence victim. She wasn't quiet, submissive, or afraid to speak her mind. This woman had a mouth on her and wasn't scared to use it. Friends described her as sharp-tongued, quick-witted, and absolutely generous to a fault. If you needed something and Corinthian had it, she'd give it to you without thinking twice. She was raising 4 boys, and anyone who's raised sons knows that takes a special kind of strength. These weren't just any kids either. Corinthian was molding young men, teaching them how to treat women, how to handle responsibility, how to be better than the generation before them. She took that job seriously. But here's what made Corinthia different from so many women who end up in abusive relationships. She had standards, high ones. She worked. She had her own money, her own opinions, and her own voice. This wasn't a woman looking for a man to save her or take care of her. She could take care of herself just fine, thank you very much. In February 2024, Corinthian posted something on Facebook that would change everything. It wasn't just a regular post complaining about relationship drama. This was different. This was a woman laying down the law about what she would and wouldn't accept from a man. The post started simple enough, but then Corinthian got real. She wrote about how she wasn't going to beg any man for attention, respect, or basic decency. She talked about women who chase men who clearly don't want them, who accept crumbs when they deserve the whole meal. But then she got specific. She called out the games men play, the lies they tell, the way they make women feel crazy for wanting basic respect in a relationship. She talked about men who cheat and then blame their wives for not being good enough. Men who disappear for days and expect their women to just accept it. Some of her posts went viral. We're talking over 15,000 shares. Women from all over the country were sharing it, tagging their friends, saying this is exactly what I needed to hear today. Why did it blow up like that? Because Corinthian said what millions of women were thinking but were too scared to say out loud. She gave voice to the frustration that so many women feel when they're in relationships with men who take them for granted. But here's the thing about that post that makes this case so heartbreaking. Corinthian wasn't just giving advice to other women. She was talking to herself. She was preparing herself for what she knew she had to do. She was building up the courage to practice what she preached. You see, most domestic violence victims are isolated. Their abusers cut them off from friends, family, support systems. They're made to feel like they have nowhere to go, no one to turn to. But Corinthian? She had a whole online community cheering her on. She had thousands of women telling her she was right, she was strong, she deserved better. That viral post became her declaration of independence. It was her way of saying, I'm done accepting less than I deserve. But it was also her death warrant, because Richard Williams was watching. He saw his wife getting all this attention, all this support for standing up to men like him, and he didn't like it one bit. What made Corinthia different from other victims wasn't just her personality. It was her platform. She had a voice, and she wasn't afraid to use it. She had an audience, and she used it to speak truth about toxic relationships. She had influence, and she used it to encourage other women to demand better. But that's exactly what made her dangerous to a man like Richard. Abusers want quiet victims. They want women who suffer in silence, who keep the family secrets, who protect their image at all costs. Corinthian was the opposite of that. She was loud, she was public, and she was done protecting a man who wasn't protecting her. The woman behind the headlines wasn't just another statistic. She was a mother, a mentor, a voice for women everywhere who were tired of settling for less. She was building something bigger than herself, creating a movement of women who refused to beg for love. But movements threaten men who profit from women's silence, and Richard Williams was about to show just how far he'd go to silence the woman who dared to speak up. When Corinthian first met Richard, he seemed like everything a woman could want. He was hard-working, running his own food service business. The man had hustle. He knew how to charm people, how to make them feel special. Friends said he could light up a room when he walked in. Richard wasn't some unemployed deadbeat looking for a woman to take care of him. He had his own money, his own goals, his own life. That's probably what attracted Corinthian in the first place. Here was a man who matched her energy, who seemed to have the same drive and ambition she did. In 2012, they had a son together. Richard seemed like a good father, a provider. He was building something, and Corinthian wanted to be part of that vision. 4 years later, in 2016, they made it official. Wedding vows, promises to love and honor each other, the whole fairy tale. But somewhere between I do and till death do us part, something shifted. The charming entrepreneur started showing his true colors, and those colors were dark. See, Richard had a problem. He confused love with ownership. In his mind, marrying Corinthian didn't just mean they were partners. It meant she belonged to him. Her thoughts, her opinions, her social media posts, her friendships, everything was his to control. The food service business that once showed his ambition, it became his excuse to disappear for hours, sometimes days. He'd claim he was working, building their future, but Corinthian started noticing things didn't add up. The money wasn't matching the hours, the stories weren't matching the receipts. When Corinthian questioned him, Richard didn't see a concerned wife. He saw a woman stepping out of line. How dare she question his moves? How dare she demand explanations? In his twisted mind, a good wife was supposed to trust blindly, support silently, and never ever challenge his authority. But Richard picked the wrong woman for that kind of relationship. Corinthia wasn't built to be anyone's doormat. She had opinions, and she was going to share them. She had standards, and she expected them to be met. She had a voice, and she wasn't going to whisper. This created the perfect storm. You had a man who needed total control going head-to-head with a woman who demanded basic respect. Richard wanted a wife who would smile pretty and keep quiet. Corinthian wanted a husband who would act right and stay faithful. The more Corinthian pushed for honesty, the more Richard pulled away. The more she demanded respect, the more he felt disrespected. In his mind, her strength wasn't something to admire. It was something to break. Richard started using classic control tactics. He'd disappear without explanation, then get angry when she asked where he'd been. He'd make plans without including her, then call her controlling when she complained. He'd flirt with other women openly, then accuse her of being jealous and insecure. But here's where Richard made his biggest mistake. He underestimated who he was dealing with. Most abusers pick women who will suffer in silence, who will protect the family image at all costs. Richard thought he could break Corinthian down like that. He thought eventually she'd get tired of fighting and just submit. Instead, Corinthia got louder. She started posting about their problems on social media. She started calling him out publicly. She started encouraging other women to demand better from their men. Every post was like a slap in the face to Richard's ego. The man who once charmed everyone he met was now being exposed as a fraud. The successful businessman was being called out as a cheater and a liar. The loving husband was being revealed as a controlling manipulator. Richard's need for control was crashing into Corinthian's need for respect, and something had to give. Unfortunately, in Richard's mind, there was only one way to win this battle. If he couldn't control Corinthian in life, he'd control her in death. The charming entrepreneur was about to become a cold-blooded killer, and it all started with a man who couldn't handle a woman who refused to be owned. What makes Corinthian Shepard's story so heartbreaking isn't just how it ended, it's how she suffered in silence while maintaining the perfect facade. To the Shreveport community, Corinthian was exactly what she wanted them to see: a devoted mother who never missed school events, a loyal wife who stood by her husband, a woman who worked tirelessly for her family. But behind that carefully maintained image, Corinthian was drowning. The people closest to her started noticing changes. Friends who had known her for years saw cracks in that perfect facade. She began confiding about things she had never discussed before: Richard's growing emotional distance and her suspicions of his infidelity. Think about what that does to a woman who built her entire world around family. Corinthian had stood by Richard through various challenges, supported his dreams, worked alongside him to give their children stability. Now she was watching him betray everything they had created together. Her friends remember those conversations, the way Corinthian would open up about her hurt and confusion. This wasn't a woman who complained easily or looked for sympathy. When Corinthian finally started talking about her marriage problems, it meant things had gotten really bad. But here's what made her situation so tragic. Even as her heart was breaking, she refused to give up on her family. She was committed to preserving the family unit for her 4 children, who deserved stability and security. So Corinthian made the choice that so many women make. She decided to suffer in silence rather than disrupt her children's lives. She continued showing up with a smile, participating in community events, maintaining her reputation as the devoted wife and mother, even as she was dying inside. The isolation was crushing her. Friends could see the woman who had always been so strong was struggling with feelings she had never experienced: heartbreak, betrayal, the devastating realization that the person she loved most was destroying their family. As 2025 began, those who knew Corinthian best could see the situation escalating. Richard's behavior was becoming more erratic and neglectful. The emotional turmoil in that house was intensifying, and Corinthian was bearing the weight of trying to hold everything together. This is the cruel reality of situations like Corinthian's. The warning signs were there. People could see something was wrong, but her loyalty and commitment to her family, the very qualities that made her an amazing mother and wife, were keeping her trapped in a situation that was slowly destroying her. Community members sensed the strain but didn't know how to help. They saw a woman who seemed to have everything together, not realizing she was falling apart inside. The months leading up to July 5th were marked by escalating tension. Corinthian was fighting multiple battles, trying to save her marriage, protect her children, and maintain normalcy in an increasingly abnormal situation. Richard was watching his wife suffer, seeing the impact of his actions on the woman who had given him everything. But instead of changing, he grew more resentful of Corinthian's pain. In his mind, her suffering was an accusation, her heartbreak a judgment, her loyalty a burden he no longer wanted to carry. On July 5, 2025, the police received reports of a shooting at the family home. When you hear reports of a shooting, it sounds so clinical, so simple. But think about what that really means. Someone heard gunshots coming from a house where 4 children lived. Someone heard the sound that meant a family was being torn apart forever. When the Shreveport police arrived at the scene, they found chaos. They found a tragedy that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. Inside the house, they discovered Corinthia. She had been shot in the upper body. The mother of 4, the woman who had worked so hard to keep her family together, was lying dead in her own home, the place where she had cooked meals for her children, where she had tucked them into bed, where she had tried to build a safe and loving environment despite everything falling apart around her. Corinthian Shepard was pronounced dead at the scene at 7:09. Just after 7 in the morning, when most people are getting ready for work or making breakfast for their kids, Corinthian's life ended. But the horror wasn't over. Outside the house, police found Richard Williams. He had a gunshot wound to the head. After shooting his wife, after taking the life of the woman who had given him everything, Richard had turned the gun on himself. But he didn't die. Richard Williams made a choice to kill his wife. Then he made another choice to try to kill himself. But while Corinthian died from her injuries, Richard survived his. The paramedics rushed Richard to Ochsner LSU Health, Shreveport. He was in critical condition, fighting for his life, the same life he had just tried to end after ending his wife's. Think about the irony here. Corinthian, who had done nothing wrong except love her family and try to hold it together, was dead. Richard, who had pulled the trigger, who had destroyed everything, was getting medical care to save his life. The doctors at Ochsner LSU Health worked to stabilize Richard. They succeeded. The man who had just committed murder was going to live. He was going to survive to face the consequences of what he had done. While Richard was in the hospital, the Shreveport Police Department's homicide unit was working. They were investigating the scene, gathering evidence, trying to piece together exactly what had happened in that house on N. Windermere Drive. But the evidence was clear. The investigation didn't take long. Richard Williams had shot and killed his wife, then attempted to take his own life. Once Richard was stable enough, the police arrested him. They charged him with second-degree homicide in connection with Corinthian's murder. Second-degree homicide. That's the legal term for what Richard did. But those words don't capture the full reality of what happened. They don't describe the 4 children who lost their mother and watched their father get arrested for killing her. They don't explain the friends who had tried to help Corinthian through her struggles. They don't account for the community that was shocked by this tragedy. Corinthian's death became the 19th homicide in Shreveport this year, the 19th time in 2025 that someone's life was cut short by violence. But she wasn't just a statistic. She was a mother, a friend, a woman who had tried so hard to keep her family together that she lost her own life in the process. The morning of July 5, 2025, changed everything for everyone who knew the Shepard Williams family. It turned 4 children into orphans, their mother dead, their father in jail. It turned friends into witnesses to a tragedy they couldn't prevent. It turned the community's attention to the deadly reality of domestic violence, and it proved something that Corinthian's friends had feared for months, that the warning signs they had seen, the changes they had noticed, the pain they had witnessed, were leading to something terrible. Richard Williams survived his suicide attempt, but he would spend the rest of his life living with what he had done, and 4 children would spend the rest of their lives without their mother. When the police cars left N. Windermere Drive that morning, 4 children were left to face a reality no child should ever experience. Their mother was dead. Their father was in jail for killing her. Think about what that means for a moment. These weren't just any 4 children. These were Corinthian's boys, the kid she had worked so hard to protect, the reason she had stayed in a bad marriage for so long, the children she had put before her own safety and happiness. Now they had lost both parents in one terrible morning. Their mother was gone forever. Their father, the man who was supposed to protect their family, had destroyed it instead. The trauma these children experienced goes beyond what most people can imagine. They didn't just lose their mom to an accident or illness. They lost her to violence. and that violence came from their own father. Where do you go when your home becomes a crime scene? How do you sleep in a house where your mother was murdered? How do you process the fact that the man who taught you to ride a bike is the same man who took your mother's life? The house on N. Windermere Drive became impossible for the children to live in. The place that was supposed to be their safe space, their refuge from the world, was now filled with memories of the worst day of their lives. Every room held reminders of what they had lost and how they had lost it. Family members and friends stepped in to help, but nothing could fill the hole that Corinthian's death left in these children's lives. She had been their constant, their protector, the person who made sure they felt loved and secure. Now they had to figure out how to grow up without her. People's response was immediate and heartfelt. Neighbors who had watched Corinthian at school events, friends who had seen her dedication to her family, people who had witnessed her strength, they all came together to support the children she left behind. But community support, while important, couldn't bring back their mother. It couldn't undo the trauma of that morning. It couldn't erase the fact that their father had made a choice that destroyed their family forever. These 4 boys now had to carry a burden that no child should bear. They had to grow up knowing that domestic violence wasn't something that happened to other families, it had happened to theirs. They had to live with the knowledge that their mother had died, trying to protect the very family that her killer had torn apart. The ripple effects of Richard's actions extended far beyond that morning in July. 4 children lost their childhood innocence. Extended family members became caregivers overnight. Friends became witnesses to a tragedy they couldn't prevent. Corinthia had spent years trying to keep her family together for her children's sake. She had endured emotional neglect and suspected infidelity because she believed her boys needed both parents. She had suffered in silence to maintain their stability, but in the end, her sacrifice couldn't protect them from the very thing she had tried to prevent. The family she had worked so hard to preserve was destroyed by the man she had tried to save it with. These 4 children are now living proof of why domestic violence isn't just about the victim. It's about everyone who loves that victim. It's about the children who lose their sense of safety, the extended family who must pick up the pieces, and the community that must confront the reality that they couldn't prevent this tragedy. Corinthian Shepard's story teaches us some hard truths about domestic violence that we need to understand if we want to prevent tragedies like this from happening again. The first lesson is the most important one. Leaving an abusive relationship is often the most dangerous time for a victim. We don't know if Corinthian was planning to leave Richard, but we do know that when a woman starts standing up for herself, when she stops accepting bad treatment, when she begins to find her voice, that's when some men become most dangerous. This is why the advice, just leave him, isn't as simple as it sounds. People who have never been in an abusive relationship often wonder why women stay. They think the solution is obvious. If he's treating you badly, just walk away. But it's not that easy. Corinthian had 4 children to think about. She had built a life with Richard over 13 years. She had financial concerns, emotional ties, and a deep belief that she could save her family if she just tried hard enough. And here's the scary truth. Statistics show that a woman is most likely to be killed by her abuser when she's trying to leave or has just left. The period right after separation is when domestic violence often turns deadly. Richard's actions prove this point. As Corinthian began to recognize her worth, as she started confiding in friends about his behavior, as she moved toward independence, that's when he became most dangerous. So what are the warning signs that a controlling relationship might turn violent? We need to recognize these red flags before it's too late. Emotional neglect and infidelity, like what Corinthian experienced, are often part of a pattern of control. When a man cheats on his wife, he's not just being unfaithful. He's showing her that she doesn't matter, that her feelings don't count, that he can do whatever he wants without consequences. We also need to teach our children about healthy relationships. We need to show boys that real men don't hurt the people they love. We need to teach girls that they deserve respect and that love shouldn't hurt. Corinthian's story reminds us that domestic violence isn't always obvious. It doesn't always involve black eyes or broken bones. Sometimes it's a slow erosion of a woman's spirit, a gradual destruction of her sense of worth, a quiet suffering that no one sees until it's too late. Corinthian Shepard deserved better. Her children deserved better. And it's up to all of us to make sure that other women and children get the protection and support that Corinthian didn't receive in time. If you found value in this crime story, if Corinthian's story made you think differently about domestic violence, then please subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a case that matters. We don't just tell these stories for entertainment, we tell them because they're important.